Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Musically Speaking concert preview. I'm Emily Marvosh, your moderator for this live stream, and I will be performing this weekend as a member of the chorus. Artistic director Harry Christophers will be back with the Handel and Haydn Society in Symphony Hall for a program of Haydn and Mozart, and I have some expert panelists with me today to give their insights into the music. I'm joined, as always, by H&H's Christopher Hogwood Historically Informed Performance Fellow, Teresa Neff. Hi, Teresa.
Hi, Emily.
Also with us is Heather Miller Lardin, our principal bass. Hi, Heather.
Hi, Emily.
And Jonathan Hess, our principal timpanist. Hi, Jonathan. And thank you all for joining us as well. Although we cannot see your faces, we would love to take your questions. You can submit them at any time using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. And I'll share them with Teresa, Heather, and Jonathan a little bit later in the program. We will do our best to get to as many of them as possible. And you can also use that Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen if you have any technical challenges during this live stream. A member of our behind the scenes H&H team will be glad to assist you. And I will also mention that this webinar is being recorded to be shared on the H&H website. So the program this weekend includes 3 pieces: Mozart's first violin concerto, written when he was 18 years old, and then Haydn's Teresian Mass, which was not named for Teresa, but Haydn wrote that when he was in his late 60s. And then the first piece on the program is Haydn's 103rd Symphony. And I know that Teresa will have some great insights and some tips for us as we listen to that piece this weekend. So Teresa, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. Allow me to share my screen. And just to reiterate, here's our program for this weekend's concerts. As Emily said, Mozart was quite young when he composed his first violin concerto. And it's a wonderful kind of spectrum because Mozart gives us this wonderful work as a very young composer. And then our 2 Haydn works, the Symphony and the Mass, come from later in his career. So we get a wonderful kind of spectrum of the late 18th century. And Haydn's symphony is his penultimate symphony for London, as well as his second to last symphony overall. And that's the work that we'd like to focus on with our time together this evening. We'll go through the movements, but I'm going to do it a little bit differently. I'm going to do the second, third, and fourth movements, and then save the first movement until last. But a little bit about the symphony. It was premiered in 1795. This is part of Haydn's second trip to London. He took his first trip just a few years earlier, just at the beginning of the 1790s. It was a huge success. And the gentleman in the picture that you see on your screen, Solomon, Johann Peter Solomon, who was the organizer of the first trip, invited Haydn back for a second one. This particular symphony is nicknamed the Drumroll, and it will be very evident why that is when we talk with Jonathan a little bit later. So I'm going to go in, as I said, and start with the second movement. Part of why I'm doing this is it's in the second movements and the third movements that I think Haydn really solidifies what he starts in the first movement, and that is giving us 2 moods for each movement. And it's very kind of blatantly stated in the second movement because this movement has 2 themes. One is in minor, one is in major. One is more stern, perhaps, but there's this wonderful undercurrent of that toughness, that sternness maybe being a kind of facade, that this is only a tough on the outside kind of theme. And then a second theme that's in major, it feels brighter, but there might even be a little sense of pomposity underneath all of that. Both of these themes, Haydn then treats to variations. He changes something each time he comes back to each one of those themes. We won't have time to get into the variations, but we do have time to give a listen to the first theme. This is the theme in minor. And remember that sense of toughness on the outside, but maybe something more gentle underneath. So here we go. Something else we can note here is the wonderful presence of the bass and the cellos. And we can come back to that a little bit later as well. If we go into the second theme now, again, we're going into major. It feels brighter, but again, listen for that kind of undertone, right? Two moods, two ideas within this second theme from the second movement. And so that's just the beginning. Each theme comes back. Haydn actually alternates them. And as I said, every time each theme comes back, we hear it in a slightly different kind of guise. In the third movement, we also get that kind of pairing of ideas. Now, this is a minuet and trio, which ultimately has that kind of pairing going on as its basic kind of structure. But even within that, the minuet has this very strong pulse, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And Haydn really uses the instrumentation and the accents to make that very, very clear to us. And with that, we can listen to the opening of this minuet, and that will come up right about here. Here we go. So that wonderfully strong character of the minuet is balanced, is changed by the trio, the next section. And you'll notice a couple of things. One is you don't have a very strong sense of 1, 2, 3 anymore. And that's why I say it feels like it wanders a little bit, because it kind of gathers itself together. We'll hear the clarinet first, and then other instruments join. And by the time we get to the end of the phrase, we feel like we've gone somewhere, we've arrived somewhere, but it kind of took a meandering route to get there. So here's the trio. And the whole thing starts again. It's a wonderful kind of counterbalance to the strong accented downbeats of that scherzo. If we go in now to the fourth movement, I put the score up here. We start with horns that have a very kind of majestic opening to them. And as they repeat that idea, we hear a second idea, which is much more playful in the strings. And it's this second idea that will just kind of take over as the rest of the movement continues. So let me play just the opening of this. And I should say that we are listening to a recording by the Tapiola Sinfonietta. And here is the beginning of the last movement. And as Haydn loves to do, there will be stops, there will be starts, there will be surprises throughout. But I saved the first movement for last because that's where some of our most wonderful surprises are right off the bat. I'm not going to start with what you see in the purple highlight up here. We'll save that for the last. Where I'd like to start is with this wonderful melody that Haydn gives to the basses, cellos, and bassoons. If you're familiar with a Gregorian chant called the Dies Irae, the first 4-ish notes might sound very familiar, but really this whole melody sets such a wonderful tone or mood for the slow introduction for this movement, as well as the symphony as a whole. So here's not the timpani opening, but the beginning of that melody for the basses, cellos, and bassoon. This kind of somber mood that we hear with this slow introduction will be counterbalanced by the allegro that follows and is the main part of this first movement. So what I haven't talked about is how this symphony opens, and that is with a timpani solo. If we look at the score, Haydn does not give the timpanist a lot of information. A single pitch, a fermata that says hold it or do something with it. And I think this is a wonderful time to ask Jonathan and Heather and Emily to join us. Jonathan, the first question is obviously to you. What do you do with that bit of information that Haydn has given us?
Well, do whatever the conductor asks. But it's like you said, it's not super clear from the score. You're just given a roll. But Haydn was a trained timpanist, and so I think it's fair to say that you can improvise some sort of a intrada type of thing. And the way I approach it, I think it's interesting that he puts it before this dies irae sort of thing that's very, mournful and singing. And he has a drum introduce it. So he writes it in E flat, which on a timpani is actually a pretty high tessitura, and the drum really rings at that range, as opposed to some of his other music, which is more like the Mass that we're playing, which is down in B flat, which is just super punchy and low. And when you're taught to play the drums, one of the first things you learn is how to do a drum roll, and that's how to sustain a note. So I sort of think of it like, how do I create the mood that, and foreshadow the mood that is coming up for the next 38 bars. And so I took a few motives from the first movement. There's sort of a triplet motive, and these sforzando accents, ba 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 bum bum ba bum ba 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 bum, in later on in the first movement, and then I took some rhythms from the second movement, and just so I wasn't arbitrarily picking some rhythms, and tried to condense it down into a little 2-bar thing, and so that's kind of how I approach it, and then I try to play it within that context. I try to play it differently every time.
So when this solo comes back towards the end of the movement, you do something slightly differently, not exactly the same as the very opening.
Yeah, I like to do something a little bit shorter, just more of a little gesture to get back into the role, because there's a whole symphony up ahead. Yeah, I want to be respectful of people's time, so I don't play the same thing. I try to in general, whenever I do ornamentation, even in Baroque music and what have you, I have my tricks, but I try to make it, as I try to make it slightly different every time I play it, just to keep, to keep it fresh.
Nice, nice. May I ask, Heather, about that very first melody that you play in the first movement? I think, Jonathan said it beautifully. It's singing, and we don't necessarily think about the bass as an instrument that will sing. I mean, obviously it's a string, but we think of the bass as more of a supporting character sometimes. And so I thought, would you like to tell us a little bit about how the bass can sing for us?
I was really taken with the way you put the score up and the words about Gregorian chant. I was feeling a little, when we rehearsed this afternoon, a little unsettled, and I realized why. Because so often, or well, most of the time, the double bass plays an octave below the cello and is supportive that way, as you suggested. And in this case, you can see in that opening, the few measures, that Haydn specifically notates the double bass an octave higher than it normally would sound. And he does that to get everybody playing the exact same pitch instead of this composite sound that we're used to making. And that really calls us to stand up and take a larger role in that opening. It's very weird, and it's, I think, just an amazing effect.
Cool.
And I'll jump in here too with a singer's perspective. There are some really beautiful, very similar moments in the Mass where every singer is singing the same note, and these really beautiful unison moments. And the beginning of the Sanctus sounds very similar to that theme. The basses have this little descending, solemn passage. And it has always amazed me. Haydn had written 100 symphonies before this and is still coming up with new material and surprising, fun things to sort of tuck into the piece as you go along. So audiences are in for a treat this weekend to hear both the symphony and the Mass. It's a fantastic program. So we have time and availability for your questions. So put any questions you have in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We would love to hear from you what you're thinking about as you're preparing to attend the concert this weekend. But I would like to talk a little bit about equipment with our instrumentalists. I'm going to start with Heather, and then we'll do Jonathan after that. But we've talked previously with Aislinn about the different bows that she uses, whether we're playing Vivaldi or Messiah or going into Beethoven. There are some different equipment applications, and even Heather, as you were saying to me earlier, bow holds, ways that you hold the bow. Can you tell us a little bit about what bows you'll be using for this concert, and how that's different maybe from what we would see you be playing in Messiah?
Very good question. So I have here a classical bow. You can't see the whole thing at once, but this is a sort of a transitional double bass bow. And the frog looks pretty similar to what it would look like if it were Baroque. It's pretty wide. It's very different from a violin or a cello bow, which would be narrower, maybe about, I'll just see if you can see from my thumb, about that far, and you would hold it overhand on top of the stick like this. I hold it sort of sideways. This is, can you see my hand like that? Let me come away.
Yep.
It's a little bit related to a viola da gamba bow hold, and it gives you, I can pick up my instrument in a second and show you, it pulls the sound from the top, and this is how double bass players played in Haydn's area in Germany and Austria during that time. And the tip of the bow here is a little heavier and a little bit more compact. If I was playing Messiah, I'd be using a Baroque bow, which would be more tapered and would give me a much lighter sound at the tip. With this bow, I can make a little bit more of an even sound, and that does help with the singing in the beginning of the symphony.
Great. And Jonathan, tell us how you change mallets from piece to piece, repertoire to repertoire, and what you'll be using this weekend.
Well, for the most part, all of my mallets for Baroque through most classical, all the way up until maybe Beethoven 5, and maybe, I guess, Eroica. I use, so 3. I use basically wooden mallets. And I have 2 main types of mallets. They have, there's this type, which is has got a cartwheel style end, and then where you hold it, it sort of gets a little wider and kind of knurled, so it sits in your hand really well. Versus this type of mallet, which is pretty much just straight. They all weigh between 30 and 50 grams, and but the different, and then some of them are covered in leather, and it changes the sound a little bit. But the main thing that dictates, well, some of the main things that dictate the type of mallets that I use is the sound that I'm trying to create. So a lighter mallet will create a lighter sound. A heavier mallet will create a heavier sound. Depending on the range of the drums that I'm playing in, I might need a mallet that encourages one thing or the other because the drum responds differently. So this week I'm using these, well, I'm using a lot of them actually. I'm using these mallets for most of the inner movements of the Haydn, inner parts of the Haydn, so the faster parts of the first movement and the second movement where we're down in the key of C. And then these are actually modeled after some sticks that were found from the time of Haydn at the Esterhazy estate. And then I'm using some more of the straighter style mallets for the opening bit, some of the slower parts, just because they give a little weightier sound. Actually, in the Haydn, in the symphony, when we're in E flat, we're really, really high up in the drums. So the drums are really pingy in that range. So I need to use a slightly heavier mallet that has a little fuller weight to it, so that I get a little more of those lower overtones out, because it is a bass instrument, so I have to remember that. And whereas, when we play the Mass, I'm down in the key of B flat, so I'm way, way at the bottom right part of the drum. And so the head, if you think of like a big trampoline, when the head's really tight, the trampoline bounces really well. But when the head's super loose, it doesn't really bounce. So you have to do a lot more of that with your technique and with your hands. So I like sticks that are a little bit shorter that have a lot more weight towards the back. So they come off the head a little more easily. So that dictates it. And then the other thing that's probably equally important is the way the conductor makes me play. Because some conductors, are very angular and, have a lot of point to their gesture, and you have to really respond to that. So I, might use one type of a stick as opposed to some conductors that, are maybe a little more smooth or let you kind of dictate your own sound a little more, at least it feels that way. I use something that's maybe a little heavier that I can play a little looser. So those are all things that go into it. It's kind of like golf clubs,
And does the fact that you by now are very familiar with Symphony Hall, does that make you confident in the combination of the drums and the mallets, knowing what the sound will sound like as it goes out into the space?
Pretty confident most of the time. For I know when I play Haydn with Harry Christophers, I have a pretty good idea of the kind of sticks that are gonna do what I need to do. When we have guest conductors, sometimes it's I leave a lot more possibilities open, or I'll throw some extra sticks in my bag, where I think I might have another approach.
You make it look really easy, but we can tell that it's very complicated. Teresa, there is a question from a listener about just the sheer numbers of symphonies that Haydn was able to write and present in his lifetime. And he says that it seems that after Haydn, nobody really got past 9 or 10. You think of the Curse of the Nine, Beethoven, Mahler, nobody got up to higher numbers. What are some factors that influence that?
Well, I think one of the factors is that writing symphonies was part of Haydn's job, right? He's working for the prince, the Esterhazy family, whatever prince that might be. There were several. And so part of his job is to supply these entertainment pieces, symphonies, other works, So that over his 30 plus years working for that family, that would be something where he would just accumulate a lot of repertoire, not to mention the commissions from Paris or these London symphonies. Beethoven, for example, is not in that kind of situation. So he's writing symphonies that he will premiere in concerts for himself, right, to benefit himself. And I think there's a sense, and it starts with Beethoven, that the composer was putting more of themselves into the piece, and I think that might be a little bit of a myth, right? I don't personally think that Haydn didn't put himself into these compositions. I think he put himself in heart and soul, but that we just look at them a little bit differently. And of course, as you said, there was this curse of 9 symphonies. No one could write a 10th. But of course, we know now that Beethoven had sketched out other symphonies. He just didn't finish them. He didn't, he had even accepted a commission from London. So, that's definitely a myth attached to it that kind of promulgated itself over the centuries.
So another special thing about the concert this weekend is that we will be recording the performances to put out yet another installment in our long series of Haydn and Mozart discs. And I'd like to ask both Heather and Jonathan, when we have a weekend like this, where we know that everything we do on stage is going to be going onto a CD, do you approach the concerts any differently? Is that extra pressure? Is that extra excitement? What do you think? I'll start with Heather.
Well, given the last year and a half that we've had, I'd have to say this time it feels a lot more comfortable walking into a recording. I mean, ideally we would approach it exactly the same way every time because we want it to be that good. But just to have that in the back of your mind, it's something to be aware of.
Yeah, that's a good point. Jonathan, how about you?
I agree. I mean, we've done a lot of recording this year. I think I I try to approach it the same way because I try to bring the same thing to a concert. But I'd be you know recordings are forever, so it kind of I I'd be lying if I say I wasn't. I don't get a little bit more nervous or a little more stressed out because it's yeah, you got to get it right.
Yeah. And what we usually do is that we record on Friday night, and then before the audience comes into the house on Sunday, we do what they call patches. So we're in there sort of just getting a couple things. There was a noise in the house, or there was something that we want to make sure that we really get. And sometimes when we feel, how I've felt in the past is if we feel really confident that Friday night was good and we like touched up the little things, then for me, Sunday feels just so free that we really, we know that we can do it well and we perform with that confidence. And often those are the better recordings anyways, without the sort of back of your mind. I know there's an engineer back there listening to every note that we're putting out into the hall. So I agree. And I think that recording weekends can be really exciting for our audiences as well. There's an extra little bit of electricity in the room. We have one more question from an audience member, and I think this speaks a little bit to what Teresa just explained about how Haydn wrote so many symphonies for a place that was his home, his home field, and then he wrote symphonies for these other places, London and Paris, and so the listener would like to know, is there a difference between popularity at home versus popularity away? Maybe comparing Haydn and Mozart in those ways. I'll send it to Teresa first, and then maybe we can get at the perspective of some players as well.
Well, if we stay with Haydn, he was, in the 1790s, one of the most popular, if not the most acclaimed composer in Europe. And so he was well regarded in Vienna. And in fact, he thought about staying in London, right? He went there the second time, and it might have been a real possibility that he would have been able to stay. But what happened was one of the princes, Prince Anton, passed away, and Prince Nicholas II, whose wife was the person for whom Haydn wrote the Mass, he became the prince, and he was a lover of music, and he got a message to Haydn that said, hey, we're going to just go for it and put the band back together. And that changed Haydn's mind, and he wanted to go back home again. So that popularity was kind of equal for him. London, Paris, Vienna. Mozart struggled with that sense of popularity in various places. He was loved in Prague. He was actually, considering going to London as well. The offer was made to him. So that's a really interesting question. Yeah.
Yeah. And Heather and Jonathan, the question was, how do you feel about using the instruments that would have been so intimately familiar at home to Haydn, and then taking those instruments to London, where maybe the bow holds were a little bit different, and people were used to seeing similar instruments being played a little bit differently. Does that affect the way that you think about these pieces?
We were, my stand partner Tony and I were talking about this today because we are using instruments that look very different and that have different numbers of strings and that were tuned differently. And I even mentioned my bow. Well, Tony is using a different kind of bow. And in London, it might be that his instrument would have been more familiar and mine would have been a little more foreign. And it's interesting for us to figure out how we're going to interpret the symphony based on those combinations and the sound that we want to make. Like, so Tony has a lower note than I do on his bottom string, and we were wondering, should he use it? Should he play that low C and make that sound, or should we try to give a more Viennese interpretation with my low F? So you'll just have to come and find out what we decided.
Right. And I'll say that about Jonathan's timpani roll too. We will all have to wait and see exactly what it sounds like in the concert. And I can't wait. So Jonathan, how about you? Was there a difference if say a timpanist in London is seeing this score for the first time? How would his instrument have sounded a little bit different than what Haydn would have heard in his head writing at the Esterházy estate?
I'm not really sure. I would imagine so. I mean, I think that the instruments in Vienna tended to be a little smaller, and they tended to be, as far as the timpani were, the smaller diameter. And they tended to have, would have goat would be the membrane, whereas in London the drums tended to be a little larger, and often sometimes they had goat, but calf was a little more common. And so, that's significant. I mean, those two things right there changed the sound quite a bit, and the approach to playing them. I think the range, and it's still the case now, and with, or at least it was up through like the 90s, the English drums, the English style of timpani playings, they tend to use larger drums. They like that sound of having the head, really cranked up to get the notes, which informs a lot of, I imagine playing Teresa Mass, or when we play Creation in a couple months, you need a really solid low F to make that work. And I can totally imagine Haydn going to London, seeing these big drums and being like, wow, I can, I can write these big low notes, and then going back and, having his drummer play it in Vienna and sort of, run into his drum maker saying, I got to get bigger drums. Like, I can't play these notes. They don't sound very good. What's he thinking? So, yeah, I mean, I think that it was pretty different as far as how the instruments sounded and how that would have worked.
Yeah. And on top of that are the individual characteristics of each player. So I'm grateful that we have both of you in the concert this weekend and joining us today. Thank you very much. One last tiny question for you. So this there will have been, depending on how you count, 3 or 5 Haydn and Mozart CDs available with that sort of signature sound of the Handel and Haydn Society. So so put this one on your Christmas list for Santa already, and you can have the whole box set for you and your loved ones. But going forward, is there anything that that the three of you would like to see a larger body of repertoire set down on record in the future? And I'm going to start with Heather.
Yes, that's such a great question. I was really impressed with some of the projects we did this last year. One was the Beethoven Ninth Symphony with a new poem for the Ode to Joy, and the other was the commission from Jonathan Woody. And both of those drew on works of the past, but they brought something new, and they made it more relevant to what we do today. And so I don't know exactly what composer or repertoire I would be suggesting, but I would love to see more projects like that where we make connections with people in today's audience, with composers who might be underrepresented, or a new take on an old work that makes it relevant to people today.
Teresa, what do you think?
I totally agree with Heather. And one specific work that I would love for us to take up is the Amy Beach Mass, a wonderful piece that H&H actually premiered in the 1890s. So I would love for us to kind of take that piece back and make it our own again.
Great. Oh, fascinating. What about you, Jonathan?
I love both of those answers. I wish I had those. I don't know. I really would like, unfortunately Harry is moving on after the season, but I would love to do Purcell. I think that stuff is so fun to play,
Yeah.
and I love Harry's stamp that he puts on it. Yeah, I think Purcell would be really great to really dive into, and also it's not super popular in Boston, but I think French Baroque, it's something that I don't get my hands on very much, and I would really love to dive into that as well.
Great. Well, I look forward to exploring all of those options with you all in the future. Stay tuned, listeners, and see what we're up to next season. We are really looking forward to performing for you at Symphony Hall this weekend. And the programs will also be available on H&H's streaming website. It's called H&H Plays On. And a special note that Thursday is Mozart's birthday. Haydn's won't be coming up until the end of March. And as always, Teresa, you're going to have fantastic program notes in the program book that'll give us even more information than we've gotten today. And if you missed the concert with Beethoven 7 and Dvorak's Symphony, that was 3 weeks ago, it is also available to view on the H&H Plays On platform. So thank you again to everyone for joining us. Thank you, and we'll see you this weekend at Symphony Hall. Have a great night.
Thank you.